Kyle Rittenhouse is found not guilty and the left loses its mind. I'm Candice Malcolm and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope everyone out there had a wonderful weekend out there with their families. It is Monday, so we are going to get back into it today. I want to talk about this Kyle Rittenhouse trial. I don't usually focus on U.S. issues here on the show because there's already so much out there where you can find commentary and analysis and opinion on what's happening in the U.S. But for this case, it's starting to spill into Canada. So I want to talk about how the left in Canada are reacting to this case and how it's relevant. So in case you haven't been following, I'll just give you a really brief overview. So a jury on Friday found Kyle Rittenhouse not guilty of murder for fatally shooting two men and injuring a third last year during the riots in Kenosha, Wisconsin, marking the end of a contentious trial that pitted the prosecution against the judge. Rittenhouse, who is 18 now, he was 17 at the time of this incident. He lives in a northern suburb of Chicago, which is about 15 miles from Kenosha, Wisconsin. So on August 25th of 2020, again when he was 17 years old, Rittenhouse decided to patrol downtown Kenosha area along with other armed men in order to protect a used car dealership from looting and vandalism. So he showed up to protect the property of a family friend. He was also there with a first aid kit because he was providing first aid to people who needed it. The city, as you may recall, had devolved into rioting over the police shooting of Jacob Blake, who was a black man, by a white Kenosha police officer. I only mention the race of the officer and the individual is because that is what the contention was. That was why we saw the looting and rioting, as we've seen in so many other instances across both Canada and the US, that this racial divide is really being amplified and pitted against people, and it's used as a platform for all of this bad behavior. So back to Rittenhouse. While guarding this used car dealership, he was chased by a mob and he ended up shooting fatally two people, Joseph Rosenbaum and Anthony Huber, injuring a third, Gabe Grosskvitz. The defendant and the three men he shot were all white. So even though the issue has that component of race, the issue here with Kyle Rittenhouse and the three people who shot wasn't a racial issue. It had nothing to do with race. It was amplified onto the national platform because of the connection to the Kenosha rioting and the connection to Jacob Black. So it was all sort of used by the left-wing media to, again, point to another example of racism in America, supposedly how this white person, Kyle Rittenhouse, who was a teenager, we were told he was some kind of a white nationalist, that he was a Trump supporter, and then he was just there shooting people up. It turns out that wasn't the case at all. So he was arrested and charged with 5 felony charges, 1 misdemeanor charge. The most serious charge was intentional homicide, Wisconsin's top murder charge, which carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. The others were reckless homicide, attempted homicide, 2 counts of reckless endangerment, and being a minor legally in possession of a firearm. And again, if you watch this case, if you watch the trial and the facts come out, which we'll talk about on the show, we'll unpack it all, it became very evident that this young man was acting in self-defense, that the entire media narrative invented about him was a pure fantasy. It was untrue. It wasn't accurate. All of the things that were said about this young man, including the fact that he was a white supremacist, he was on Tucker Carlson, and he said that he supports Black Lives Matter. He supports the BLM movements, and he supported the protesters who were there. He was, again, simply there to help provide order, to protect property, and to provide first aid. So again, the entire media narrative about him was basically false. This is what it looked like, a very, very powerful moment in the courthouse. This is what it looked like when Kyle Rittenhouse was found not guilty.
H. Grosskreutz, we the jury find the defendant Kyle H. Rittenhouse not guilty.
Members of the jury, are these your unanimous verdicts? Is there anyone who does not agree with the verdicts as read? Would you wish the jury polled? No. Okay. Okay, folks, your job is done,
And today I'm delighted to be joined by a young writer, brilliant young writer who keeps the website Slow to Write. His name's Samuel Sey. And Samuel wrote about the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. He wrote about how it isn't really about white privilege, but it's about a different kind of privilege. So Samuel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm a big fan, so thank you.
Well, we're a big fan of your writing over there. And really, you have a very thoughtful way of looking at things. I like the name of your website as well, Slow to Write, because, it's not like a hot take. It's not like a quick reaction. You're very, very thoughtful in regards to how you analyze these kind of issues. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your take on the Kyle Rittenhouse trial and what we're seeing sort of as a reaction?
Yeah. In the article you're referring to, I say something along the lines of this trial is definitely a consequence of privilege, but Kyle Rittenhouse isn't the beneficiary of that privilege. He's the victim of of privilege. And what I mean by that is there are two prominent privileges at display here from the beginning of this entire saga in Kenosha and in the trial. And it's primarily Black privilege and leftist privilege. What I mean by that is the whole issue in Kenosha started because a black criminal um, uh, allegedly was abusing his ex-girlfriend, which led her to get a restraining order against him, and then he violated that in one instance and was attempting to perhaps assault her again, and then she called the cops, and the cops came to arrest him. This man is Jacob Blake. And then when the cops were trying to arrest him, he was fighting them off and nearly grabbed a knife, which he later admitted is true. He was about to grab a knife, which would have threatened the cops' lives, of course. And the cops ended up shooting him in the back after several warnings. Um, so immediately, the entire similar to the George Floyd issue, the entire world and cultural institutions ended up attacking the cops as being racist, strictly because he was a black man, for no other reason, but because he's a black man, which led to the riots. And then, of course, that prompted Kyle Rittenhouse to go to the riots to defend a family friend and to help protect the area that he's very familiar with. Um, and in there, some of the supporters who are leftist white men attacked him. And I've seen the entire video. He clearly was acting in self-defense, as the jury recognized as well too. And these white leftists, these people who were trying to harm him, and one, Gage, I'm forgetting how to say his last name, but the key witness is his first name is Gage. I think it's Grotzquist, something like that. He actually took out a pistol and was about to shoot him in the head before Kyle Rittenhouse. And incredibly, like he honestly was very brave in his entire demeanor. He ended up shooting him in the arm to keep this man from shooting him in the head. So then this white, perhaps conservative, I can't call him a leftist. I don't know exactly where he is, but assumingly he is some kind of a conservative. Um, he he then is on trial for homicide. Meanwhile, the people who are trying to harm him, who are white leftists, are seen as victims, including the two who were killed and the one that was injured. My point in saying all that is, a lot of conservatives, I think, mistakenly say this is a matter of what Kyle Rittenhouse's skin color. I don't think so necessarily. I think it plays a role, but I think considering that his victims, well, I shouldn't say victims, because his attackers were white. I think it's that he is a white conservative. That's the real issue. And so that's why I'm saying that it's really a matter of Black privilege and leftist privilege. If he was a leftist, he would not have been on trial. The same way that Antifa, many of them being leftists, have been attacking people for for several years now, and there've been very little justice against them.
Well, and that was part of the thing. I mean, there's so much that we can unpack in what you just said. Let's start with the initial interaction with the police that led to all the rioting, because to me, from my perspective, Samuel, so much of it kind of blurs together. There's been so many instances of what appears, at first sight to be an instance of police brutality caught on tape. We know that when something's caught on tape, you're not really getting necessarily the full perspective. Remember that with the Covington high school kids, that all of the footage that originally came out kind of showed these boys perhaps being the aggressors and starting it. And then once we saw the full context, it became very clear that the boys were just waiting for their bus to bring them back to school, and the other side were the agitators. And it changed the entire perspective. So with this specific case with Jacob Blake, I remember this one pretty distinctly because I just happened to be watching the news closely when it happened. I took some interest in it because like you said, this was an instance of a dangerous criminal who was violating a restraining order by harassing and perhaps even raping his former girlfriend. And she is the one that called the police to get him out of there. And once the police arrived, he was evading them. And then it wasn't until he sort of dove into his car to grab at something, we don't know what it was, that he was shot. So I just want to know your perspective on these cases. Do you think that there is a problem with police brutality in the U.S.? Do you think that there is an underlying issue with racism in police, or do you think that like this case with Jacob Black, that the police are for the most part well trained and really just get a bad rap from the sort of prevalence of people focusing on anecdotal evidence and not the statistics, and people focusing on the fact that we can now see, because of cell phone footage and things like that, we can now see what police interaction with law enforcement looks like, and to some people it's just jarring. They don't like it. So where on the spectrum do you lie on that issue?
Well, one example of police brutality is one too many, right? So on just on that at all, I will say that of course there is police brutality, but that's true everywhere. I think the issue is that it's completely and utterly overblown. It's not anywhere near as prevalent as some make it out to be. When it comes to them being well trained, that's where I would say is the issue. From my understanding, there is a lack of training involved. Even now, all the talks about police reform, it's really dealing with defunding them, which will just make things worse, of course, or it's just body cam footage, which is good. But the problem is it's still not going to be dealing with their real issue, which is that they're underfunded actually in many ways, and they are not receiving the kind of training where they need, where the only kind of training they have now is, well, if your life is in danger, shoot. And if their life is in danger, they should do that. But there are certain things they can learn before that, which would be helpful for them to be to avoid being in a situation where their lives are in danger. In terms of the racist aspect, in almost all these cases about police brutality against Black people, racism is cannot be proved as the basis for this. Even now, people don't want to talk about this, but even the George Floyd issue, which is now considered the biggest example of police brutality against a Black in a racist fashion, there is no evidence at all that it was racist. You can talk about it being police brutality and everything else, but in terms of the motivations behind it, we don't know that at all. So I don't think there is a case at all of, in fact, Black police officers are actually much more likely to be, to commit police brutality against Black people than white people are, than white cops are. So I don't think racism at all is the issue here. I think it is oftentimes that the cops are justified most of the time in these cases, at least in these major cases, and people just not understanding what good police work really looks like, and then see these videos and they think, well, wait a minute, these cops are being aggressive. Well, they have to be aggressive, otherwise, yeah, otherwise they'll not go home that night. We talk a lot about these interactions when it comes to police being the aggressors in times. Well, in America, every year, 50 cops are killed. And that's actually much more than the number of unarmed Black people that they kill, right? It's significantly more than many imagine. So these cops are aware that oftentimes if they're not aggressive in defending their lives, they will not go home.
Right. And okay, so then in your article you talk about, in your essay you talk about what you call Black privilege. So after Jacob Blake was shot, he wasn't killed, but he was, I believe, paralyzed. We immediately saw the reaction, which looked very similar to the George Floyd reaction, where there were some honest to goodness protesters who were just out there saying, we don't like the system, we don't like what's going on in our community. But then what we see is there's always this sort of bad apples that take advantage of the situation, and they want to go out and they want to riot. And it seemed like one of the individuals that was killed this evening by from the gun of Kyle Rittenhouse was one of these individuals. This guy had spent a bunch of time in prison. He was a pedophile. He was a sex offender. He just seemed like a pretty bad dude. Not Black. He was white, and he was one of the people. But it seems like whenever there's a case of sort of the justice system coming up in the public face, there's that mix. And we see, I believe that the funny scene in Chiron, that fiery yet peaceful protest, came from this Kenosha riot. But from watching this trial, all of the elements were there. They were rioting. And Samuel, we saw it over the weekend. So I used to live in San Francisco. I spent a few years living there, and I saw some footage from San Francisco, from Walnut Creek, of basically just people taking advantage of this outcome to go and loot and riot very expensive stores. We're talking about Louis Vuitton and Nordstrom. I think we have some footage of that. So we're gonna play this clip, and then I'll get you to react. So let's see what that looked like.
Like a well-organized operation, people sprinted to waiting cars carrying bags full of merchandise from Nordstrom's in Walnut Creek Saturday night.
I saw people running down the street. I probably saw 50 to 80 people in like ski masks, crowbars, like a bunch of weapons.
In one dramatic scene, a car veered around a police SUV to make a getaway, but another officer stopped him with his gun drawn. 3 people were arrested. All are charged with robbery. One of them is also charged with being a felon in possession of a gun. NBC Bay Area has obtained a still image from a security camera inside Nordstrom's during the robbery. A company spokesperson says 5 of their employees were injured, police saying at least 3 workers were assaulted, one with pepper spray. And tonight, there is still cause for concern. Walnut Creek police took to social media warning about the possibility of another robbery. Some high-end shops like Tiffany's closed early. Janet Catalano and Marnie Pantar were the last customers in the store as staff locked their doors. How are they in there?
They're a little nervous.
Definitely.
They are a little nervous for sure, as I would be too if I worked retail in this area right now.
In a prepared statement, the mayor of Walnut Creek says the city is actively working to try to prevent any of these incidents from happening here again. And you can see that they are already taking efforts. The street going through Broadway Plaza Mall has been blocked off for most of the day. And police officers are everywhere. Nordstrom's is still closed, a bit of an inconvenience for customer Frank Augustin, who couldn't return a pair of shoes.
It's such a shame that, we have to worry about this. And you see it in San Francisco at, the Louis Vuitton on Friday night.
The situation in Walnut Creek coming just 24 hours after a similar robbery in San Francisco. 9 stores were either burglarized or vandalized. Some store workers were also injured. There have been 8 arrests so far, and San Francisco's police chief says there will be more. In Walnut Creek, Sergio Quintana, NBC Bay Area News.
So Samuel, so maybe you can help us break down this phenomenon. Why do people get away with this kind of looting and rioting in the aftermath of a public decision, and why do you describe all of this as Black privilege?
Yeah, I think there's 2 reasons behind it. One is there's the soft bigotry of low expectations for Black people, in that people think so lowly of Black people that they think, well, what do you expect when they have when there's so-called living under oppression? Therefore, then that they expect us to live like animals, where we just end up going around scrapping for goods, so that's the first reason. The other reason is, and I think this is a much more sinister reason behind all of this, is that Black privilege exists because leftists and critical race theorists want to use racism as a basis for changing the system, as a basis for creating a revolution. I think that is what's really at play here, is that the reason why they would defend and eulogize and speak well of pedophiles and and abusers is because they're willing to use anything they possibly can to change the system. So Kyle Rittenhouse really isn't they hate Kyle Rittenhouse, but only because he is an example of a person who is defending or who still supports the American Constitution, in that he still believes in the Second Amendment, of course, because he had that rifle with him. And I think it's really about changing the system and changing America's founding principles, or really Western principles, and not so much these individual cases.
Well, yeah. So one of the things that came out. So I'll just say when the case, this trial, the facts of it first came out, before it was a trial, but just when it hit the media that some people were killed during these riots, and it seemed like it was some kind of a white nationalist or white supremacist that was they're shooting it up. That's sort of the impression that we got from the media. And it wasn't really until you look at the facts of the case, when it became the trial, you start to look at some of the video footage, where it became pretty obvious, pretty evident, Sam, that this was a case of self-defense. I saw a video of this young man, and he was talking about how he was there to provide first aid. So he had his medical kit right on him. He just said the gun is for self-defense, and then right in the middle of an interview, he ran off because he was trying to help somebody. So it seemed like someone who was there, yes, to defend the property of a family friend who owned a car dealership where the cars were getting torched and there was millions of dollars in damage every night. But he was also like he was a good citizen. You could describe him as someone who was there to help maintain order in a very chaotic time in American life. And yet like you said, because of the way he looked, because of perhaps the principles that he was upholding, the media just did their best to demonize him in a way that was so divorced from reality after watching the facts of this case. And we saw some of that in Canada too. Sam, I just want to read a couple of the kind of reactions that we saw. So Jagmeet Singh, who's a leader of the NDP party, a leader of a political party in Canada, he says this: "I knew today's verdict is painful for many. It feels like another failure by a broken system designed to protect some and hurt others. For those that carry such grief and must continue to witness denials of justice, my heart is with you." So first of all, he's saying that the U.S. he's commenting on the justice system of a foreign country, saying that it is a broken system that is designed to protect some and hurt others, and then he says flat out that it's a denial of justice. So I suppose Jagmeet Singh would rather see a young man convicted of murder, a murder that he didn't commit. He didn't commit murder. He was found not guilty of that. He was acting in self-defense. So why is it that people like Jagmeet Singh and I mean there's others, Toronto Star writer Shri Pardkar, I think that's how you pronounce her name, Shri Pardkar. She writes, "Damn the laws that acquit Kyle Rittenhouse, for they show no care for justice." So no care for justice. Charles Adler, popular radio host, used to be a conservative, but now he's gone the other direction. He says, "There are those who think that if Kyle Rittenhouse was a young African-American, the verdict would be the same. I am not one of those." What do you think of these Canadians commenting, and what do you think of their take on the U.S. justice system?
Yeah. We all know that America absolutely influences Canada, and that there are a lot of similarities there. But when you are an elected official and you're commenting, as you said, on a foreign nation's system, essentially, that's a major problem. But the reason why Jagmeet Singh is saying that is because he believes the same thing about Canada. He believes that our system is also broken and it's only designed for a particular kind of people and to harm other people. I mean, AOC said the same thing. And AOC is really his counterpart in the US. And AOC said the same thing about America's system, that basically it's designed for white supremacists to protect white people and to harm non-white people. And this is really a very, very important thing. I think a lot of us conservatives are focusing on the wrong issue here. We're focusing on the racial aspect here. And that is true. This is really about a racial issue. But the racial issue, as I said earlier, is being used as a basis to change the system in America and in Canada. That critical race theorists and leftists believe that our Western system is broken. They truly believe that it was designed to be broken for everybody else and to privilege other white people. So when Joe Biden himself also called Kyle Rittenhouse a white supremacist, they know he's not. They don't care. They're just saying that the entire system that people like him want to defend is white supremacy, and therefore they need to change the system and then to truly get rid of due process, which is why they're ignoring that that there was a verdict reached by a jury. They're ignoring all that because they believe that entire system is meant to support white supremacy and white privilege. So I think that the real issue here is that we need to recognize that these Canadians and these Americans who are angry at the verdicts, at least not all of them, but many of them, some of them don't know the facts, right? But those who do know the facts, they're simply ignoring the facts as a means to change the system into a more socialist or so-called anti-racist and communist system.
Well, it's just so interesting that, again, from watching the facts of this case, Samuel, the thing that seemed unfair to me was the fact that this was even on trial, the fact that this was even a high-profile case, because as soon as the facts were there, I mean, all they had to do was prove reasonable doubt, and surely it wasn't like they described. And I'm surprised that a prosecutor would have even taken this case up. You said that many of them don't really know the facts of the case. I'm not trying to pick on Robin Urbeck here because I think she's a really good writer, but this is what she put on Twitter, and it kind of just goes with our conversation. So I'm going to read it out, and pardon my language because I'm going to read what she writes, and it's not entirely it's not entirely sanitized. But anyway, she says, notwithstanding how much of an asshole this guy is for carrying around a rifle during a protest like a dress-up G.I. Joe doll, the prosecution's case here was pretty tough. The defense didn't have to prove Rittenhouse was acting in self-defense. The prosecution had to disprove it. So it seems like my takeaway from that tweet was that that Robin was mostly offended by the way this guy looked, right? She called him an asshole, and she said he was dressed up like a G.I. Joe doll. I travel around the world, and I know that in a lot of places where the situation is chaotic and unstable, that you see weapons, you see people, usually military, but in some places you see plainclothes officers, like in Israel. You go just about anywhere in Israel, and you see people with weapons across their chest in the same way that Kyle Rittenhouse looked like, because they're there to protect people in case of any kind of an attack. And some people might not like that's the reality in the United States, but you mentioned the Second Amendment, and that's part of it. And it didn't seem like, from the interviews that I saw of Kyle Rittenhouse the night of the protest, he wasn't there as a vigilante. He was there, again, to keep order and to try to protect people. And yet, again, because of the way he looks, I think it's turned into this racial animosity. And the other thing, Samuel, is that the 3 people that got shot that night were all white. They were all sort of Antifa type rebel rousers that seemed like, from all the evidence that we saw in the case, were there to cause no good. The fellow you mentioned, Gabe, who drew a gun and tried to shoot Kyle Rittenhouse in the head, he was there as an ACLU observer. So he's sort of part of the leftist institutions that we're supposed to revere and respect if you're watching the legacy media. And yet, from his own testimony on the stands, it seemed to me that he was much more there as a criminal as opposed to a peaceful protester. So, final question for you. All of this is just to say, what's the kind of takeaway that we can have, and what can conservatives do to sort of push back against all this entire cultural war that we find ourselves in the middle of?
Yeah, I think we need to recognize that, honestly, a lot of white people, white Canadians, white Americans need to stop being afraid of being called white supremacists or white privileged, because they believe that about every white person, especially if you're conservative. You just need to know that they're saying that really because of their view of the Western system, the Western society. And really, it's not really about you, because if you support Black Lives Matter, then they say, okay, then you are the good kind of white person then. So it's really just an attack on you and your good principles. Is not because of your character. Because with Kyle Rittenhouse, they didn't know anything about his character. They were simply attacking him instead of his attackers, instead of the criminals who were trying to end his life, because they were supporting Black Lives Matter. They were on the right side by supporting the riots. But if you are against the riots, then you are the enemy. So just knowing that it's not really an attack against your character, it's an attack against your principles. And I think also just recognizing what critical race theory is. As I mentioned before, this is really about leftist privilege and Black privilege and not white privilege. That is what these guys want. That's what the leftists want. They want to change America. They want to change Canada, and to get rid of the founding principles that created these nations. And they're willing to use things like this. They're willing to use racial issues and every issue as a way to manipulate and indoctrinate people into wanting to get rid of the system, a system that would actually help someone like Kyle Rittenhouse from being a victim of mob justice.
Right. Well, protect them from being wrongfully accused. I mean, that used to be a cornerstone of our society, something we were so proud of, due process and the rule of law. And today it seems like those things are demonized. Well, Samuel, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your brilliant writing over at slowtowrite.com. We really appreciate hearing from you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.